One of the places where existentialism and phenomenology touch, the phenomenologists, of course, make the case that reality is best conceived of as the totality of your experience, even if that includes things that you wouldn't normally consider you. But certainly it includes things like emotions and motivations and bodily sensations and all the things that aren't precisely rational. The existentialists would take that claim and push it a bit farther by saying, and this is analogous to something I already told you, that the degree to which that phenomenological field, your field of experience, is fractured and incoherent and paradoxical, that occurs in precise proportion to the weakening of the spirit within you that necessarily has to be strong in order to remain uncorrupted by the tragic conditions of existence. So along with the existentialist claim, which is that life is unbearable in its very nature, it's tragic and unbearable in its very nature, is the idea that that's made worse by your own set of inadequacies that you could repair, and worse, that to the degree that you are rife with inadequacies that you could repair, you're going to make the tragic situation that's integral to life worse. Again, not only for yourself, but also for other people. So out of existentialism also automatically arises a kind of moral necessity, which is that you can't just sit in isolation and be useless and resentful. That doesn't work. If you're useless and resentful and you refuse to address the things that you know you should address, you can't help but pathologize everything around you. And so you're stuck with a moral duty. And the existentialists would say more than that. They would say that if you don't shoulder that existential burden, that existential moral burden, you will inevitably suffer for it. You cannot get out of it. You're stuck with it. So existentialists are great believers in free will, in that you have choice. But the free will has parameters, right? There are still things that you can't get away with. And one of them is you fundamentally can't get away with being immoral. The structure of existence is set up, well, one of the things you might say, if you were thinking about it existentially, is immoral things are precisely those things that you can't get away with. That's why people have identified them as immoral, is that they will inevitably, the consequences of enacting them will inevitably be brought to bear on you or on the people you love, or it'll snap back in some way. You know, and I see this in psychotherapy very often too. People will engage in the same kind of behavior over and over. Well, there's a classic definition of insanity, which is insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome each time. And there's an element of self-deception in that. It's like people will run out a procedure that ends in tragedy, and then they'll repeat that over and over, and you can lay out for them the causal connection between their actions and their conceptions and the outcome. And they'll listen. But there's no change whatsoever in behavior, and so then they run through the routine again, and bang! And what they're doing is immoral precisely because whenever they implement it, it produces the kind of catastrophe they claim to want to avoid. Because, you know, relativists, modern relativists, like to think of morality as something that's just arbitrary, like it's a cultural construction. You know, and society 1 thinks that A is bad, and society 2 thinks that B is bad, and when you get right down to it, there's no commonality underneath all that. But the existentialists sort of undercut all that, and they just say, well, what's immoral are those things that you could change, that you do, that result in outcomes that are catastrophic for you. That's it. That's what immoral is. And so that's universal, because it doesn't really matter what the details are. You know, like what you do that's immoral could be very much different than what you do. It might be temperamental. You know, we're each in our own playing field in a sense. But there's a commonality underneath that, which is, well, for example, you won't get away with deceiving yourself. You just can't. And the reason you can't is because you need a model of the world that's like the world. And if you try to live in a model of the world that isn't like the world, you'll just bump into the world. And so the deception brings with it its own punishment. And that's why it's immoral. There's other elements of existentialism that I think are extremely interesting. For example, the definition of truth in existentialism is different than the definition of truth that might be characteristic of objective materialism. So truths that are truths from the perspective of objective materialism are scientific truths, and they're usually descriptive truths. And so the truth claims of science go something like this. I'll undertake a procedure, which I'll tell you about, and I'll observe the outcomes. And then if you undertake that procedure, and you observe the outcomes, and the outcomes are the same, you know, and we'll do this maybe 100 times, just to be certain, then we'll assume that what that outcome is real. So it's a definition of a procedure, that's the experiment that elicits the outcome, and then the demonstration that the outcome is constant across observers. So that's a lovely definition of truth, and it obviously has extreme utility, partly because it helps you separate subjective fantasy, which is a form of reality, from other forms of realities. So another form of reality would be collectively apprehensible reality. You don't want to confuse those two things. In fact, that's actually a sign of, if not naivety and a state of undeveloped differentiation, it can also be a sign of insanity, because one of the things, say, that characterizes schizophrenics is they can't tell the difference between what only they experience and what everybody else experiences. So the scientific definition of truth is a perfectly reasonable definition, but it's not the existential definition of truth. The existential definition of truth is more action predicated. So for the existentialist, truth is a way of being. It's not a collection of descriptions. So it's more embodied, you know, from the Piagetian point of view. And so truth is reflected in what you act. So Nietzsche would say, for example, it doesn't matter what you say. It matters what you do. And if I want to figure out what you believe, I don't ask you. I watch how you act. And I assume that your true beliefs are those that are directing your actions. And so truth is discovered in action. And that's a very different claim, you know, and it's not the claim of a passive observer. It's the claim of someone who's actively interacting with the world. And of course, we're always acting interactively with the world. And not only that, if we don't act interactively with the world, we cease to exist. So we have to do that merely to maintain ourselves. And so the existential claim would be, given that's in our essential nature, there are ways that you can act that are they're improper. And technically, it's like, for example, let's say you want A. And then you act in a bunch of ways that makes it absolutely impossible that you will get A. It's like an existentialist would say, well, there's something wrong with that schema. Like it's not necessarily immoral, because that would only be if you were willfully blind to it. But they would certainly say, well, it's got this self-contradictory element that makes it wrong. So insofar, it's like this. Insofar as you're acting towards an aim. You want something. And then insofar as you want something, the fact that you want it constitutes the framework within which you evaluate the utility and truth of your actions, right? So it's like you come up with a theory of truth just because you're doing something. And the theory is, A, that what you want is acceptable to want, and you know, that can be true or not, but it doesn't matter, you just assume that. And B, that those things that will get you to that end are appropriate. You can't get out of that if you're doing something. You're making a claim about the structure of the world and what constitutes appropriate action as soon as you make any action. You can't get out of that.